Welcome to our latest Nesta Talks To, our conversational event series with today's most exciting thinkers on the big topics related to our missions and innovation methods. My name's Laurie Smith, and I lead on lots of the research in the Discovery Hub at Nesta, the UK's innovation agency for social good. We design, test and scale solutions to society's biggest problems. Our three missions are to help people live healthier lives, create a sustainable future where the economy works for both people and the planet, and give every child a fair start. The Discovery Hub is responsible for helping bring the outside into the organisation, considering the consequences of trends and technologies for Nesta's work, which brings a link to the subject of today's discussion, Reimagining the Internet. Please join in the conversation in the comments box on the right-hand side of your screen and ask any questions throughout the event. Closed captions can be accessed via the LinkedIn live stream. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Ben Tarnoff, who's a writer who works in the tech industry. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Guardian, the New York Review of Books, among many other places. And his most recent book is Internet for the People, The Fight for Our Digital Future, which is published by Verso in June 2022. He's also co-founder of Logic magazine. Welcome, Ben.
Hey, Laurie. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us. So shall we start? But maybe we would be talking about reimagining the internet. Maybe you could tell us about the first time that you personally used the internet.
Yeah, I actually vividly remember the first time I used the internet. This would have been probably 1994. I would have been about 9 years old at the time. And I was with my mother at a place called the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry in Portland, Oregon, which is a beautiful building overlooking the Willamette River. And like many little boys, I was obsessed with space and astronauts. So I was walking around this huge museum looking for rockets and astronaut ice cream and kind of things of that sort. And we stumbled across this small computer room. And we were told by the attendant that all of these computers were connected to something called the internet. Well, I had never heard of the internet at the time. I don't think my mom had either. But we sat down, and at this point, this was before the kind of birth of the modern search engine. So it might have been Yahoo or a different kind of directory that we used to try to find websites to access. But I just completely fell in love with it. I mean, I searched for information primarily about Star Trek. So I tried to figure out how big is the Starship Enterprise, by millimeters or whatever. And it just completely blew me away that there could have been so much information accessible through a computer. Of course, the irony being that the World Wide Web back then was much, much smaller than it is today. But that was the beginning of a long love affair with the internet, which continues to this day.
It sounds like our childhoods in many ways remarkably similar, with interest in rockets and so forth. I suppose that brought you through, your sort of career to sort of book, which is sort of the central sort of focus of our discussion. Maybe in a nutshell, what's the sort of central argument in the book?
Well, the central argument of the book is quite simple, which is that the internet is broken because the internet is a business. Which is to say the various crises that we've been grappling with in recent years, like the annihilation of our privacy, the proliferation of hate speech through social media, the exploitation and degradation of app-based workers like Uber drivers, that all of these are connected to the fact that the internet is owned by private firms and run for profit. And my book is primarily a history. So it's a history of where the internet came from and how it came to be a private, profit-driven system, because the internet actually originated as a public system. So the process by which the internet was privatized in a particularly comprehensive way laid the foundations, in my view, for the various crises that we're seeing consume the internet today.
And what made you want to write it? Why do you feel the need to sort of tell this story?
It's funny, I think there are very broadly two kinds of writers who write about what they love and writers who write about what they hate. And I've always been in the former. I couldn't possibly spend so much time with things that I hate. And this kind of foundational moment for me in 1994, where I did really fall in love with the internet, and then went on to be a kid who spent probably far too much time sitting in front of a computer. I think there was a personal element of trying to reckon with not exactly a sense of mourning and nostalgia, because these are emotions I'm a bit suspicious of politically, but trying to, at minimum, comprehend what had happened to this world that I love so much. Not to say that I fell out of love with it or that it's been corrupted beyond redemption, because I don't feel that way. But nonetheless, these massive transformations have taken place, of course. And I wanted to understand where they came from. And then, of course, it's not purely a personal story. It's also stepping back, particularly the past 5 years, this so-called techlash moment where the popular discourse, our political system, people are paying attention to the scandals, to the dysfunctions of the modern internet in a new way. I also wanted to make an intervention at that level and try to figure out, well, what's the root of the problem? Where did things actually go wrong?
So so you sort of talk about the concern around a sort of private internet. What does that mean for people's lives? I mean, sort of day to day. Maybe you could take it through the impact on someone's life in the day of a sort of typical citizen.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think we have to answer it in such a way that matches the complexity of the internet itself, because the internet is woven into really every aspect of our lives at this point in advanced capitalist countries, right? It's indispensable to our social lives, of course, but also to our civic and political lives, to our economic lives, our ability to find a job, and so on. In the book, I offer, a fairly crude way of breaking down the internet, but I think one that's helpful for our purposes, which is that you can think about the internet in two parts: the pipes and the platforms. The pipes being the physical infrastructure. How do you get online? The platforms being, a fairly familiar term to all of us at this point. What do you do on the internet? The apps and sites that mediate your experience of the internet. When we talk about what have been the consequences of extreme privatization, what have been the consequences of surrendering the internet to a handful of large companies whose only purpose is profit maximization, we have to say that the consequences look different depending on the layer of the internet you're talking about. So when it comes to the pipes, we have the internet service providers. Now, this is a landscape that looks a bit different in different countries, but using the United States as a case study, we can say that the more market-driven, the more profit-driven a system is when it comes to the provision of internet service, the more likely it will be for service to be very high cost and very low quality. And again, the United States is emblematic, paradigmatic in this respect. We have a highly concentrated market in internet service. We have higher internet rates than Europeans or folks in Asia. And we have probably rank about 15th in average connection speeds, below countries like Thailand and Romania. And this is the outcome of a series of policy decisions that have created a kind of dictatorship over internet infrastructure in the hands of a handful of corporations. Now, when we move up the stack and talk about the platforms, the consequences of this profit maximization model are quite different. And I'm going on, so I'm going to just very briefly sketch a few, and we can go deeper if you like. We could think about the way in which a company like Facebook is driven by, of course, the profit motive, as all of these firms are. But in the case of Facebook, driven by the need to acquire as much of our attention as possible so as to monetize that attention through the sale of personal advertising. And as has been thoroughly documented by research, both inside and outside Facebook, this drive towards the maximization of this attention capture apparatus leads quite directly to Facebook prioritizing inflammatory, bigoted, hateful content, because this is content that the algorithm itself recognizes tends to spread faster, produce stronger reactions, and thus grab attention. So in the case of Facebook, we can see a quite direct link between the need for Facebook to generate revenue, to grow market share, and the degree to which its infrastructure prioritizes inflammatory content with, as we've seen, pretty severe political consequences.
Really interesting. And you use sort of talking of some of the sort of challenges of this privatization. I think in the book you use two quite evocative metaphors about, you talk about sort of slumlords and online moles, which I think you describe as inequality machines. What do you sort of mean by those sort of two metaphors? They're quite evocative.
Well, this maps again to this distinction between pipes and platforms that we were talking about. So in the case of the pipes, I characterize the major firms who control the pipes of the internet as slumlords. And slumlords, because these companies are in the business of declining to invest in infrastructure so that they can use the exorbitant rates that they're charging customers to funnel that money upwards into the hands of investors, primarily through buybacks and dividends. And similarly, when it comes to housing stock, slumlords tend to very significantly underinvest in things like repairs and infrastructure so that they can just leach as much money out of the system and funnel it upwards. And this has been the model, again, the United States being the paradigmatic case, but certainly replicated in various places around the world, the model of a profit-driven approach to internet provision. Now, when we move up the stack, so to speak, to the world of the platforms, I use these other metaphors. As you mentioned, the metaphor of the online shopping mall, which is my kind of attempt to provide an alternative metaphor. Metaphors when it comes to computing are really important because we can't see the bits. So all we have are these abstractions to help us understand what's going on. In my view, platform is not the best abstraction, because it does a lot of work for the companies themselves. It suggests a degree of neutrality, of openness, of even-handedness that is not actually happening, right? We know that these firms are intimately involved in the organization of our online life. They're not just providing a flat surface for us to interact upon. So to my mind, the idea of a shopping mall is actually a bit more accurate because the shopping mall has this architecture that is designed in order to encourage you to do certain things, like to shop. And we can go deeper into the details of that metaphor if that is interesting. But the other metaphor that I use, which you referred to, is the inequality machine. And this is my attempt to form a kind of generalization of, well, there's so many of these different types of platforms or online malls. Facebook is very different when it comes to its software than a company like Google or Amazon. These are different business models. These are different computational infrastructures. What do they have in common when it comes to their downstream effects? And I think in different ways, all of these firms and systems generate inequalities. Now, these could be inequalities in the form of Uber developing more sophisticated techniques of algorithmic management in order to better exploit workers and contribute to greater inequalities simply at the level of wages by displacing the kind of what was once a lower middle class profession of taxi drivers and replacing them with folks who are earning poverty wages. That would be one direct example of that. But as we've already discussed in the case of Facebook, for instance, that inequality can also be generated at the level of our informational environments. It can be generated by giving new resources to the forces who want to promote inequality, by giving a megaphone to the forces of bigotry and hatred, as we've already seen. But I think inequality, once again, is the guiding thread in terms of what have been the consequences of the forces of privatization reaching up the stack, if you like.
And yet, even since you've sort of written the book, it came out last year, there have been sort of great strides in digital technology, such as, say, the release of ChatGPT-3, which is getting lots of attention at the moment. What might be the consequences of such sort of technological change, be on both the internet and the case you make in the book? Does it change anything, or is it essentially just another layer on the stack, but it's part of the same problem?
It's a good question, and it's a question I'm hesitant to answer directly because the history of the internet is littered with people making pronouncements and prophecies that turn out to be completely false, right? And when you write a book about the history of the internet, you find all these people saying, in 5 years, it's going to be like this, and 10 years, it's going to be like this. And they're all wrong. And you're like, wow, I don't want to end up like one of them. So I wouldn't put anything down in stone. I would say in general terms that the basic core architecture of the internet is remarkably robust and resilient. The internet fundamentally is a set of protocols, the TCP/IP protocol stack. And the original protocol, the kind of father protocol, if you like, is developed in the mid-1970s in the series of experiments that are funded by the Pentagon, which I talk about in the book. And that, the code, the rules have changed a bit over time, but the fundamental principles that were developed in the mid-70s are still the fundamental principles on which the internet runs. And I find it hard to believe, although it's certainly not impossible, that will change in any significant way. I remember, this already feels like a century ago, but when there was enthusiasm around the concept of Web3, which was essentially a rebranding of blockchain, there were some, I think, kind of overly enthusiastic speculation that blockchain could serve as a new fundamental architecture for the entire internet, that it could somehow displace TCP/IP and these basic principles that have been at the center of it for decades. I find that hard to believe, but certainly all sorts of things can happen at the top of the stack. And, the platform model, again, I don't love the word platform, but the kind of set of computational infrastructures, this approach to doing the web in a particular way, which really emerges in the early 2000s and has become, completely dominant in our own era. I think it's fair to assume that at some point that paradigm will break down. What replaces it is an open question. Web3 was a kind of bid for that. VR and the metaverse was another bid for that. Those bids appear to have failed or at least receded. More will emerge, so it's hard to know.
Right, so should we move to thinking about, you've obviously got your really helpful diagnosis of this challenge, maybe you can start having opening up the box around solutions and turning to those solutions. You talk in the book about early pioneers of public and community approaches to the internet, so as alternatives to the private sector. One of which, rather to my surprise, and maybe it shows my ignorance, came from London's GLC back in the 1980s. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so in the 1980s, the Labour Party left controls the GLC, and they undertake a number of experiments, largely at the level of industrial policy, which are quite interesting. One of them is to establish a number of centers throughout London, which they called technology networks. And these were spaces that today we might think of as hacker spaces or maker spaces, but these were essentially spaces in which ordinary people could walk in, get access to different types of tools, machine tools and other tools, get access to various forms of expertise, so be partnered with people who knew what they were doing, and develop technologies that were designed to improve their lives. Many of the technologies that came out of the technology networks focused on energy efficiency. It's kind of interesting, kind of early sustainability technologies. And technologies that were developed went into a common database where other people could access, corporations could license them for a fee, which helped support the technology networks. When I stumbled across this history, I found it really generative because I think it gives us a model for how we could put resources into creating spaces in which ordinary people can come together to try to begin to imagine the internet that they want. In the book, I talk about a lot of existing alternative models to the profit-driven internet. And I think it's very important to point out that many of these models already exist, are already functioning, and we can think about them as providing some of the building blocks for what we might call a deprivatized internet. But it's also important to acknowledge that none of these existing alternatives are quite enough. And part of their problem is that they're not quite imaginative enough. we actually need more imagination to really try to remap the internet, to try to kind of think outside of the paradigms that we have been provided by the corporate internet and really try to stretch the parameters of possibility. The technology network seemed like one model for leveraging the power of the public sector to direct resources towards spaces in which people can come together and do that imaginative work in space, in an embodied way.
So if you sort of thinking about reimagining the internet, I think it's a really sort of powerful way of putting it. What should we do to reimagine the internet now? What practical action should be taken? Is it recreating what the GLC did? Is it something different? What would be the fora or the spaces or the institutions that would do that?
Well, I think the GLC is one model. So you could imagine municipalities, for instance, putting together their own maker spaces or hacker spaces and saying, we want to create a space in which ordinary people can come in, get paired with software developers, get access to the tools they need, and develop perhaps hyper-local or local or municipal or even regional alternatives to social media. So maybe we want to create a decentralized social media system of the kind that is already prefigured somewhat by Mastodon, but we want to do it at the municipal level. How do we put local citizens together with the people with the expertise and start to develop some prototypes? Maybe we want to develop a worker-owned alternative to Uber that only operates within this municipality. Can we get some taxi drivers together, maybe the taxi union, software developers? So you could see it as a kind of clearinghouse for these different initiatives that will necessarily need to activate different kinds of expertise. But through this, prototypes can emerge and potentially be scaled with, of course, the appropriate resources. But I think, again, this thing about imagination, it's tricky because on the one hand, we want to empower people to think very creatively about what an internet that serves their needs would look like. On the other hand, it's important to give them existing alternatives so that they can recognize that a different internet is possible. It's hard to be sitting purely in kind of Facebook world and imagine from there. It helps if you have some kind of intermediate step. For instance, if you've used Mastodon, again, Mastodon is incomplete. It has a lot of issues, as people have discovered, particularly recently, as folks have been looking at it as an alternative to Elon Musk's Twitter. But nonetheless, I think Mastodon is a perfect kind of intermediate step because it starts to defamiliarize the internet that we know. It starts to show you, oh, maybe there is a different way of organizing it, but it's not enough. From there, we need to do something a bit more creative. But it is this process. I think there are stages involved.
And you talk, and sort of digging into some of that, you talk in the book about the importance of content moderation, sort of to deal with some of those sort of polarization. You talk about it as a form of care, which I think is a really interesting analogy. Perhaps you could sort of unpack that a little bit, because often care isn't associated with the sort of very technological, sort of digital view of the world.
Well, when you think about what content moderation is, it's really a way of reproducing our social lives on the internet, making it possible for our social lives to be able to continue on the internet in a safe way. And so there is a kind of direct analogy, I think, to the work of care, to broadly the work of social reproduction, to the work of healing people's bodies, healing their minds, showing them love. I think that is, without being excessively sentimental about it, the basis of how the world continues. If we didn't have care, societies could not continue to function, regardless of how poorly compensated that work tends to be. So I think there is a quite direct analogy to caring for our online spaces. I think the hard part with one of the many hard things about content moderation, however, is that it's very difficult to arrive at decisions about what kind of content should circulate in social media spaces and how precisely it should be moderated. And I think it's important to note that I don't imagine that any of the solutions, or not even solutions, any really of the frameworks provided in my book will provide a magic bullet to that question or to any of the questions. I think the deprivatization paradigm that I'm trying to explore is not so much a way to answer all of these questions, but to provide a space in which the answers can be found. I think so long as you have an internet that is owned by private firms and run for the principle of profit maximization, all of these decisions are going to be very heavily constrained by the parameters of profit. And we've already seen this with content moderation, right? Content moderation can only happen in a particular way so long as it's existing within the confines of a capitalist firm. What I want to suggest is how we might do content moderation differently if we were working outside of the constraints of the profit motive. What might it look like? What kind of practices could we develop towards it? And this will involve difficult decisions, and this will involve deliberative processes and politics and collisions around values. But that's, I think, ultimately the best way to do content moderation, to not have Mark Zuckerberg and his investors get to determine how content is moderated, but to have some type of democratic process where we have difficult and indeed angry conversations, but we have a deliberative process.
So that's really helpful. I'm now going to sort of turn things over to the audience who've been sort of asking some questions as you've been speaking. The first one I've got up is from Fran Bernhardt. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. And one of the questions she puts is, I'd like to know if you've got any advice on how to effectively address industry lobbying, which is currently successfully undermining many worthwhile public health policies. Presumably she means in relation to the internet.
It's a great question, Fran. And, my book is in part a history of industry lobbying, because it's really the influence that industry brings to bear on the political system that has ensured that privatization has taken the particularly extreme course that it has, that different possible internets have always existed. There have always been other paths that we could have taken, but the extent of industry influence has ensured that we have ended up with a extremely privatized model with, the various attendant social consequences that we've been discussing so far in our conversation. How does one counter that power? One has to build a sort of counterpower through mass movements from below. I think that's the only way we've ever had a degree of democratic control in our political system. And these mass movements have taken different forms over time. The labor movement obviously comes to mind, the civil rights movement in the United States being another great example of a mass movement. But it takes large numbers of people undertaking disruptive action in their communities and through electoral processes. And that can feel like a big lift, particularly these days, living in a kind of demobilized era, I'm afraid. But I think it will take a movement to build a better internet.
And so moving to another question, in fact, there's a submitted in advance of the talk, so I'm not sure who it's from. This is about sort of, you touched on how the GLC, lots of its, the sort of work it did involve both the internet and sort of environmental issues as well. And this question is sort of, how can the pathway to net zero be facilitated by new technologies and presumably also the internet? What are the most important technological applications of, say, the internet in the environmental space, so the intersection of those two trends?
Yeah, it's an important question. I should say, first of all, that the internet poses a major problem for the climate because data centers in particular are extremely energy intensive and are only becoming more so with certain AI applications. So if folks, you mentioned ChatGPT, Lori, ChatGPT runs on these large language models, which are very, very, very energy intensive. So there is already a significant difficulty that the internet poses for climate. In terms of the more positive examples of how could the internet and digital technology contribute to energy efficiency, we do have some examples if we're looking for a bit of hopefulness. In fact, one of the community networks that I discuss in my book, which is a major success story here in the United States, this is a municipally owned broadband network in Chattanooga, Tennessee, that is actually one of the most popular ISPs in the country, is known for delivering very good service, very reasonable rates. It actually originated because the local electric utility used federal stimulus funds during the Obama era to build what is called a smart grid. So they essentially embed these various sensors throughout the grid, and it improves energy efficiency. It makes it easier for them to know if there are outages. Instead of waiting for a call, oh, the pole fell down, we can see, oh, this neighborhood doesn't have electricity. So you embed all these sensors into the grid, and then you connect them with a fiber optic network, so they can all talk to each other and talk to you. And they realize once they put in all this fiber, hey, we could also actually use this to serve broadband to the city of Chattanooga. So that is kind of one example of, as we are improving our energy infrastructure, in particular our electricity delivery infrastructure, it's possible to do so in such a way that we are also improving our broadband infrastructure.
And then we've got another question this time from David Barker, which is a live question. And he asks, when do we as citizens have to take responsibility for what we buy and how we behave, as it also drives the dystopian markets of products and services that do not benefit society, as negative impact locally and globally? So I suppose how much of it is our responsibility as citizens, and how much of it is it the responsibility of these private companies?
The issue of responsibility is always a tricky one, I think, because on the one hand, I think particularly these days, there's a lot of resistance to the idea of individuals taking too much responsibility for their behavior. One will often hear the argument that, well, it's difficult to buy things not on Amazon. These companies have gotten so big, are so invasive, and even if you try not to buy things on Amazon, you're almost certainly using websites that are running on Amazon Web Services, right? There's a kind of ubiquity to it. And that's, I think we have to recognize that there is a kind of basic truth to that, that it is increasingly very difficult to live your lives in such a way that you do not come into contact with any of these companies. Even if you are not conscious of using their services, you may in fact be relying on their services without knowing. On the other hand, I do think that personal responsibility is important. It's maybe a bit unfashionable to say, but it's, the only way the world changes is when individuals do make different choices. Now, those choices have to be made at scale. They have to be made with one another. They have to be made on a collective basis. But it does have to start somewhere. So I'm afraid that's a very unsatisfying answer, but I think there is, obviously space, and in more than space, a kind of requirement for individuals to begin to live differently. But if they can't do so in such a way that those different choices are magnified through some type of broader social process, then it doesn't go anywhere.
And another aspect, sort of thinking about the relationship of the individual to the internet. There's a question here from Milan Todorovic. I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. But how do we regulate the internet without impinging on personal freedoms, while also preventing its misuse? So that's a trade-off at the other end of the spectrum between the individual and the collective.
This is an important question. And again, I think it's one that has fallen a bit out of view. In the 1990s, there was quite a lot of discourse from cyber libertarians about the need to protect the internet from government regulation. Figures like John Perry Barlow, for instance, were quite foundational, or the kind of early days of Wired magazine, if folks remember that. These days, those figures and that way of thinking has, I think, largely fallen out of fashion, because much more of the focus these days is on our corporate overlords rather than on government. Now, of course, that depends on where you live globally. But let's say, particularly in the West, that is where the focus of the so-called techlash has been concentrated. But I think it's quite important to remember the Barlow era, because you did have, in the case of the United States, we had something called the Communications Decency Act, which large portions of which got struck down. But there was a quite concerted effort to regulate speech on the web. And, that effort was largely defeated. And of course, once these very big businesses were built on the basis of the web, I think the desire to do so receded. But nonetheless, I think we have to keep in mind the ever-present threat of government censorship of the web. I think that remains. Censorship itself has become somewhat politicized term in the U.S. context because of allegations, particularly from folks on the right, that social media firms censor their speech. But I think this original threat of government censorship of the internet, which of course is a reality in many parts around the world, has nonetheless, I think, often receded from our view, and we have to be very conscious of it, particularly if what we're talking about, as I am in the book, is leveraging the power of the public sector to grow a kind of deprivatized internet.
Interesting you say about government censorship. I remember reading somewhere that someone did some research into what Chinese censors on the internet censored, and apparently the top thing they censored was criticism of the censors. So they sort of paradoxically had this machine
circular quality. Yeah.
So moving on to a slightly different topic that was raised in some of the questions that were sort of sent in advance. Someone asked, is there an official or international movement for the new internet? There's some work Nesta did a little while back called the Next Generation Internet. You might have heard of that. But are you aware of any sort of movement to try to regulate and sort of manage it that goes beyond national boundaries?
Well, I would say there are reform impulses throughout the world. Whether they take an international cast, I think it tends to be quite limited, because these reform impulses tend to be operating at a regional or a national scale. And I think there are some points of contact between them, some common concerns, but nothing that really resembles a robust global movement around a kind of set of principles. It's an interesting question because, here in the United States, we have a couple kind of main reform currents. One of them is anti-monopoly, which has become quite influential in recent years, particularly in the Democratic Party. Another is a bit older and, continues to be concerned with questions of privacy primarily. And I mentioned the kind of cyber libertarian tradition. There remain organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who remain very committed to this question of kind of personal privacy rights and trying to protect them, particularly in an era of platform surveillance. On the European side, of course, you also have some of these same reform impulses operating, but it's a somewhat different political picture. Of course, the European regulation landscape tends to be much more sophisticated than the American one. You have obviously GDPR and now these newer regulations around anti-monopoly and content moderation coming in at the European level. I think the bottom line is that there really isn't a coherent movement for a better internet. Not just does one not exist at the international level, but I would venture to say that there isn't a robust movement of that kind at the national level, really, either. You have different reformers with different ideas and some coalitions that have been assembled, but whether any of this deserves the word movement, I would be skeptical at this stage.
And you sort of talk about movement just now, and also in the book as well. And I suppose just to sort of play devil's advocate a little bit, often when there's sort of big problems to solve, the solution is often a movement of some sort. Then it's just this bottom-up thing that's sort of driven from the grassroots rather than sort of being top-down. But I suppose at a practical level, how do you go from now to social movements, if you see what I mean?
Well, that's always the question. That's always the question. Well, I think, look, there is immense utility in having practical alternatives that you can point to. And this is why in the book I talk a lot about these publicly and cooperatively owned broadband networks like the one in Chattanooga. We have hundreds of these in the United States. These are not experiments. These are completely operational. They tend to provide much higher speeds at much lower cost than their corporate counterparts. They tend to have a degree of democratic control where member owners, for instance, in the case of cooperatively owned networks, can vote for the board of directors. So when we're having conversations with people in order to try to build up something that resembles a mass movement, in terms of how we get from here to there, which is the core of your question, Lori, I think it's really important that we can point to existing alternatives that are not perfect, that have a lot of limitations, but nonetheless begin to stretch people's imagination of what's possible. If those alternatives didn't exist, then it would be harder to take those steps because they figure, well, it's all impossible anyway. What do you mean? But if you can actually point to stuff that works, it could be Mastodon, it could be these community networks, it could be, say, a worker-owned Uber alternative in your municipality, whatever it is, it starts to get people's minds thinking, oh, maybe there is something there. Maybe it makes sense to start to take these little steps towards something. And of course, like with any of these movements, you have to demonstrate that it is within their interest to do so. It's going to be very difficult to create a mass movement on the basis of moral claims, to say, well, you should do this because it's good for you, good for the world. It's the ethical thing to do. I think you get a few people that way, but that's not how you get mass movement. You have to actually knock on doors and say to people, a community network would be better for you. It will give you higher speeds at lower cost, and it will give you democratic input into how that network is run. A decentralized, democratically moderated social media network would be better for you than Facebook for X, Y, and Z. So those are the kind of conversations that you have to have, I think, in order to build up a movement. I think the last piece, though, is that we can't be excessively voluntaristic about this, unfortunately. I think there are strategies that we can develop of the kind that I've been discussing. But at the end of the day, one doesn't really get to choose when a movement occurs. And I think you see that throughout history. There's a confluence of factors that are kind of way beyond the control of any individual that has to emerge in order for a period of social mobilization to erupt. And I think it's fair to say that we're not going to get just a movement to build a better internet. The movement to build a better internet is going to be integrated into a wider movement to transform society. And when precisely that movement arrives, we can't know and we can't control.
And sticking with that, I suppose we sort of started this particular thread talking about sort of international sort of movements. And we've got a question here from Giorgio Scavino, who asks, what do you think about the Fediverse approach, which I must confess isn't something I've heard of, the Next Generation Internet Initiative, working for an alternative future of the internet? I don't know if it's something you know about or not.
Yeah, so I think the Fediverse is very cool. The Fediverse, for folks who don't know, is essentially the broader Mastodon ecosystem. So Mastodon, through a particular protocol, can interconnect with these various other services that are essentially decentralized versions of services that folks know, like YouTube and Instagram and so on. And together they all form the Fediverse. And the basic principles are the principles on which the internet is built, which is interoperability around a common set of open protocols. You publish the protocols and people can write services that interact with one another through these protocols. So these are kind of time-honored traditions. And I happen to think that that's the right, technical architecture going forward. I think, unfortunately, most of the difficult issues are not technical. They're social, they're political. It actually doesn't take that much time to write really interesting, cool code that does cool things. It takes a lot of time comparatively to create the kind of social and political conditions in which those types of alternatives can really flourish. And I think that's what we're already seeing as folks migrate to Mastodon, is like, hey, there's some really cool stuff here, but a lot of the missing pieces aren't technical so much as they're social and political.
And harking back, you chatted much earlier in our discussion about Web3, and there are a couple of questions that were sent in advance. I don't know who sent them in about that sort of topic. I know you sounded a little bit skeptical, but I'll put the questions to you anyway. And so one of the questions is, how do you see public non-profit organizations integrating digital and Web3 in their day-to-day? What value would that add to both the organizations and the users and visitors? There's a second Web3 style question, which talks about Web3 plus 2, or Web5, which is something I haven't heard of identity management as a tool for new person-centric internet. They'd be interested in your comments on that. So 2 Web3 related questions.
I think it's incumbent on Web3 to demonstrate its value to everyone else before we begin to think about those experiments. I guess I'm not convinced that the case has really been made. Again, Web3, I think it's important to say, is a kind of rebranding of blockchain, which was developed by venture capitalists kind of in their own interest. So I think there's also an open question whether we are wise to even accept the term Web3. I think blockchain itself is a very divisive issue. As we've discussed in its current iterations, it doesn't always have to be this way, but certainly in the case of Bitcoin, it's enormously energy intensive. So I think we have to say it is a direct contributor to the climate crisis. And it's also, again, in its current iteration, quite sleazy. I mean, there's a lot of very scammy stuff that is happening within the blockchain ecosystem. Now, if one goes back and reads the original white paper, the technology is kind of interesting. So I think my position is that we don't exactly know all of the purposes to which blockchain could be put. And it's possible that in 2, 5, 10 years, an implementation of blockchain that is socially useful emerges. But I don't think we've seen it yet. And I think Ethereum, which was initially seemed to gesture in that direction, I think has really not fulfilled its potential.
And then on a slightly different topic, we've got a question from Tina Harkonnen, who says, how do you see digital education as a tool to reinvent the internet? In Finland, we're currently creating new material for teachers about the basics of the data economy, not just data protection or about media literacy, but also business models of other major platforms. What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think it's essential. Digital education used to mean teaching people how to use the internet, basically. And I think more recently, we've seen an effort to deepen and broaden the definition so that we're teaching people about how is data being generated about them? Who holds that data? How is that data monetized? What are the business models that have been constructed around it? That's the kind of digital education, the kind of digital literacy that I think we really need to develop, because, particularly young people, they know how to use the internet. In fact, they could stand to use it a lot less. What they need to learn is, how is the internet using them? What is the political economy of the internet that they've been kind of born into? And again, with an eye towards defamiliarizing it, with an eye towards historicizing it, towards telling them it doesn't have to be this way. This is the outcome of certain choices, certain political forces, and we could do something different. So I think this brings us back once again, Laura, to this question of imagination. I think digital education is actually a place where that kind of imagination can start to be encouraged.
Really interesting. We've got another question from Gail Freeman. He says, a global action plan, we're campaigning for a UK ban on surveillance advertising. This is to address the system behind the toxic content, as opposed to regulators playing whack-a-mole with harmful content. What do you think of this?
I love it. I mean, I think a ban on so-called targeted advertising is a great step forward. I've seen proposals for this in different forms and in different contexts, but it's a good step. I think this is also one in which you could imagine developing a broad degree of popular support. People really dislike the idea of being spied on invasively by these firms. So I think it's a great step, but again, it's a first step. I think we want to use that as a wedge into this broader conversation of what would it mean to build an internet that didn't spy on you? What kind of online communities and structures could we develop where surveillance wasn't at the center?
And this sort of leads us nicely to another question from Stephanie Ellis, who asks, which you sort of touched on a little bit already, but how can a public data infrastructure and data collectives contribute to a democratic and discrimination-free internet and society? How can people participate?
Yeah, these are big questions. And I think this last piece of how can people participate is really the key, because you can do public and cooperative ownership in a variety of different ways. The critical thing to my mind is not so much the ownership model itself, but what new kinds of practices does that ownership model make possible, right? Why construct publicly and cooperatively owned entities in the first place? It's because unlike capitalist firms, they have the potential, not the guarantee, of course, but the potential to institute more democratic forms of decision making. And that's, I think, what I always look for, because particularly terms like public data infrastructure, that can be mobilized in kind of bureaucratic ways, particularly in an industrial policy context, that do not put popular participation at the center. And I think that's what we really need to prioritize when we're thinking about alternative ownership models.
And we're coming up to sort of time, but I'm using my chair's prerogative to ask one sort of final question from me. And late last year, Nesta published a supplement with a UK-based magazine called Prospect, called Minister for the Future, in which we imagined a fictional minister who faced 8 long-term challenges and asked doers and thinkers, such as yourself, to propose solutions. And one of the challenges was that of a privatized winner-takes-all internet. What would be your suggestion for a minister for the future to tackle this challenge?
Well, my suggestion would be to leverage the power of the public sector to direct resources towards publicly and cooperatively owned alternatives to the big corporate providers. Now, what that looks like is going to depend on a local and regional basis, but fundamentally, we need a deprivatized sector that can cultivate true democratic alternatives to the Facebooks, the Googles of the world. That's what I would tell Mr. Minister or Miss Minister.
And that might not be so, that might be particularly relevant to the UK as we're coming up for an election. It's surprisingly soon. So,
perfect.
First, I want to sort of thank everyone for a really interesting discussion, which has provided lots of food for thought. I hope everyone in the audience has found it useful. Now they've reached the end of the event, I'd be really grateful if those joining us could please fill out a short survey. The link will be shared in the chat and is also available in the event's description as well. As a thank you for filling in the survey, you'll be entered into a prize draw to win a £50 voucher for bookshop.org. And hopefully you could buy Ben's book amongst many others that Nesta will be sort of talking to. So I'd also like to say, sort of join me again on Thursday, the 16th of March for another episode of Nesta Talks To. I'll be sitting down with Guy Vince to discuss climate migration, solutions and opportunities. So registration for this event is now live. It's on our website. And also if you sign up to our newsletters, we'll let you know about other events that are coming up. So thank you so much again for joining us. And thank you, Ben, for speaking with us.
Thanks so much, Laurie.
Thank you very much indeed.